Thank you so much, Jenny, for that wonderful introduction. Good evening, everyone. So today I'll be talking to you about how it's possible to locate the experiences of marginalized people and include their stories into relatively well-known historical accounts. In the summer of 2019, I began researching the history of Queen Anne's Revenge, which was the Pirate Captain Blackbeard's flagship. And he was active in the Carolinas in the early 18th century. The research that I conducted was on behalf of the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources under a joint project between the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission and the Queen Anne's Revenge Conservation Lab. And while we know what the exploits of Blackbeard were with Queen Anne's Revenge, such as his blockade of Charleston and that he eventually sinks the ship off of the coast of North Carolina, what happened to the ship before is less well known, and that is where you find stories of marginalized people who are associated with Queen Anne's Revenge, particularly enslaved African captives. Now, we know that the archive is history's main source to study the past, and it is well documented that it is imperfect by people like Sadia Hartman and Marissa Fuentes, because the documents contained are related to people that are deemed important within a society. So for long periods of time, that meant that women, indigenous people, African descendant people, members of the LGBT plus community, and disabled people might be excluded from the archive. But the experiences of African descendant people can be found if you look closely. And the history of Queen Anne's Revenge suffers from the problems associated with the archive, in part because of several things. Just because of the way that the archive is constructed, but also because it was a ship, so it circulated around the world, particularly the Atlantic world, and it made trips to Europe, the western coast of Africa, the Caribbean, and North America, which means that the information related to anything about the ship might be in repositories in any of these places or kept privately in the homes of people and families who know anything about it. Additionally, what happened with the ship occurred in the early 18th century when there was a lack of standardized spelling and different languages between all of these places, so there are some other barriers to researching the history of this ship. Yet, despite the obstacles, the experiences of African descendant people with and on the ship that Blackbeard called Queen Anne's Revenge can be reconstructed. And this information that I'll be talking about today is from things found in the Archives Department of the Loire-Atlantique and Nantes, such as the ship's muster rolls and post-sailing accounts. It also is derived from records from the American archives related to Blackbeard and his exploits, and also material, culture, and artifacts recovered from Queen Anne's Revenge shipwreck that have been conserved by the Queen Anne's Revenge Conservation Lab in Greenville, North Carolina. And those artifacts and that material culture has been recovered since 1996 when a private company found the shipwreck off of the coast of Beaufort, North Carolina. Okay, Beaufort is, if this is North Carolina, that is Beaufort, and the ship was found in the Atlantic Ocean, not very far from Beaufort. And in 2012, Mark Wild-Ramsing and Charles Ewan wrote Beyond a Reasonable Doubt, A Case for Queen Anne's Revenge, which established that the ship that was found in 1996 was in fact Queen Anne's Revenge. And since that time in 1996, things from the site have been excavated, conserved, and some even put on display in the Maritime Museum of North Carolina in Beaufort. So this is the site and the current excavation efforts. And you'll notice that there's a grid, and things have different color coding that relate to when sites were excavated. And you'll notice that part of the area that is part of the shipwreck has yet to be excavated, and hopefully in the future those sites will be excavated and anything recovered conserved. So I'm going to start this presentation by discussing the previous history of Queen Anne's Revenge and its owner. Then I'll discuss the ship's role in the transatlantic slave trade. Next, I'll explain how Blackbeard came to have the ship. And in my conclusion, I'll reiterate how African descended people experienced their time on Queen Anne's Revenge. Before Blackbeard acquired Queen Anne's Revenge, it was a French privateering and slave trading vessel called the Concorde. The ship was owned by a man named René Montaudouin, a merchant and influential resident of Nantes. Montaudouin not only owned ships, multiple ships, slave trading vessels and privateering ships, but he was also a political figure. He held a position known as échevin, or in English, it means alderman. And historian Benoit Garneau states that échevins, like Montaudouin, would make decisions about taxation, local police, housing for soldiers, supplies for the militia, highway maintenance, and town planning, water, public lighting, firefighting, supervision of markets, fixing the price of bread, education, and how to assist the poor. So as an échevin, Montaudouin was partially responsible for governance of the city. Additionally, as owner of a privateering ship, he took on some of the responsibilities of supporting his nation's military efforts during the War of Spanish Succession. And we know that Le Concorde, as his ship, was a privateer for the War of Spanish Succession. So during that war, what occurred was that Charles II, the King of Spain, died, and he didn't have an heir. He was a member of the Habsburg dynasty. So following his death, European nations fought for about 13 years between 1701 and 1714 over whether a Habsburg or a Bourbon would be placed on the throne of Spain. Now, which dynasty gets to rule was important because it meant that if there were too many Habsburgs or too many Bourbons, then that would frustrate the balance of power in Europe. So naturally, different nations with monarchs belonging to different houses had different ideas about who should be in charge of Spain. But Montaudouin is with Spain. He is, in order to assist France in their efforts in this war, he is given permission by the government to sail and conduct raids on ships of opposing nations, while also accumulating wealth for himself and for the nation that he's assisting. So anything that he does while his ship is a privateer, anything that he recovers from another ship or like when they sail at port belongs to both him and France. And we know that Le Concorde was only a privateer from 1710 to 1711. And at that time, it's recorded as having weighed 300 tons and having about 26 cannons and sailing around Caribbean islands. And it's during this privateering year when African descended people are first known to board the ship. So while Le Concorde is a privateer ship, it raided a slave trading vessel of the Dutch and took the enslaved captives aboard the ship. And although it is unknown where the Dutch ship acquired their captive human cargo, we can assume that these enslaved Africans were purchased on the western coast of Africa. That the Dutch slave traders might have been headed to perhaps Curacao or Suriname with their human cargo, and that these enslaved captives who were taken from their homes and likely unsure of the fate that would befall them upon disembarkation also experienced an attack from the crew of the Concorde, which resulted in them being transferred to another ship. According to records, these enslaved captives taken by the privateers of La Concorde were then brought to the French island of Martinique and sold. So it's very likely that their transatlantic voyage with the Dutch would have ended with their enslavement. However, because of La Concorde's privateering activities, they had the added trauma of an attack, and they end up in Martinique rather than a Dutch possession. Beginning in 1713, La Concorde officially became a full-time Nantes slave trading vessel. So the city of Nantes was perfectly poised to participate in slave trading missions during the Atlantic era. Geographically, you'll notice this is a map of France in the 18th century. So geographically, there are 3 rivers at which Nantes is at the confluence of: the Severn Nantes, the Loire, and the Erde. These geographic features mean that the city had a lot of skilled sailors and also a lengthy history in maritime endeavors, well before the transatlantic slave trade. Additionally, there were a lot of citizens there who owned ships and many people willing to invest in slave trading voyages. So that, and also the fact that there were a lot of French laws that made international trade more advantageous than internal trade, meant that their participation in the transatlantic slave trading would be one of the most lucrative endeavors they might engage in. It's because of this profitability of the transatlantic slave trade that France becomes the largest slave trading nation, and that Nantes is the leading slave trading French city during the 18th century. Based upon my research into the slave voyages database during the first 80 years of the 18th century, about 2,261 French ships engaged in slave trading. These ships disembarked with over 600,000 captive Africans. Nearly half of all of those missions, so about 1,037, or about 45%, listed Nantes as their point of origination. This figure means that about 28 ships would leave France annually during the first 80 years of the 18th century. So people in Nantes, like René Montaudouin, who owned ships, could make a lot of money if they regularly commissioned transatlantic voyages. And that is perhaps why he has missions, slave trading missions in 1713, 1715, and 1717. As you probably noticed, there seems to be about a 2-year gap between each of La Concorde's voyages. And that's because although slave trading is lucrative during this time, it's also a time-consuming endeavor where preparations need to be made well before the ship even embarks upon the journey. Prior to departure, they would need to ensure that the ship was in decent enough shape and condition to travel. Then the ship owner would need to sell shares to investors to fund the voyage. The owner would then need to hire a captain and a ship doctor for the journey. After that, the captain would have to hire the rest of the crew members necessary. So on a ship like the Concorde that is around 300 tons, that would be between 55 and 75 crew members, depending on the journey and how many enslaved people that they might bring with them. So before the 1713, 1715, and 1717 voyages of La Concorde, all of these events had to occur. Now, typically, slave trading missions from Nantes left in the spring, and the 1713 slave trading voyage was no different. It departed on April 13th with a crew of 58 sailors led by Captain Isaac Thomas. The ship arrived in Wada, a city off the coast of modern-day Benin, in July of 1713. For around 3 months between July and October, the crew remained in Wada. So these next group of Africans to experience the Concorde were about 418 enslaved captives that the ship left with in October of 1713. During the voyage, which took around 2 months until December 14th, these African captives were placed under the hull of the ship and probably spent most of their time constrained there on their way to Martinique. Of the 418 who were initially purchased, only about 53 of those enslaved African captives arrived and waited to be sold, which means that 65 captives died during the voyage. And like the enslaved captives stolen from the Dutch ships, these 353 enslaved captives were sold to enslavers. So the ship then returned back to Nantes in 1714, and it was not long before preparations began being made for the 1715 voyage. The ships, the 1715 slave trading mission, embarked on, started in February with a crew of 63 men, and they were captained by Matthew Denys. And although the voyage left from Nantes and went to Africa, then to the Caribbean before returning to Nantes, Le Concorde visited different locales. On this expedition, they sailed to Congo with 331 captives. And it's thought that, so during this period of time, there was a conflict in Wada, which meant that it wouldn't necessarily be safe for the crew to dock there, and they might not be able to purchase enslaved Africans. So Montaudouin's captain makes the route for this trip Congo rather than Wada. And during that voyage, 31 of the enslaved captives died on board, which means that they arrived at their destination with only 300 enslaved people. And so they go to Haiti rather than Martinique, and the way that transatlantic voyages work in this period and that sailing works is that where you're able to travel to or from is dependent upon currents. So they go to the Congo and they end up in Haiti, and that could have been because of the way that the ocean circulation and the winds, and not necessarily a deliberate decision. It might have been easier to get to Haiti from the Congo than it might have been to get to Martinique from Congo. So these people who end up in Haiti likely ended up working on sugar or coffee plantations on the island, because we know that Haiti was the largest producer of sugar and coffee in this era. The ship then returned to Nantes in 1716, after which the plans began for the final slave trading mission. And it's during this mission that the last African descended people sailed on the ship under the name Le Concorde. So if you look at this map that is from the Queen Anne's Revenge Conservation Lab, this shows all of the missions, and I'm going to talk about the last one shortly after this. But so this green, the green line represents the privateering mission. The black line is the first transatlantic slave trading voyage. The yellow line is the second voyage, and the and the red line is the final voyage. And you'll notice that all the other lines continue, and that red line ends in the Caribbean. So it was unsuccessful and unable to be finished. So for this final mission, Montaudouin hires an experienced sailor named Pierre Dosset to captain Le Concorde. He leaves Nantes with a crew of around 70 people, including a doctor and his assistant, men to sail the ship, people who could make repairs to the ship if necessary, and people who were gunners and able to man the cannons if under attack. When the Concorde leaves from Nantes in the spring of 1717, it's after being delayed for a few weeks by bad weather. And we know that at least 2 of the people that are listed on this, the muster roll, are in fact people of color. So there was a man named Dominique Demy and another named Joseph Allard. Both Demy and Allard were simply notated as having been sailors. We know that Demy is identified as an Indian, likely from an Irish town, and Allard is recognized as being a black man from Judah. And Judah can be another name for Wada. So that place in modern-day Benin where Le Concorde went on its first mission in 1713. And historian Dwayne C. Pruitt has shown that there was a sizable population of people of African descent living in Nantes in the 18th century when Allard lived there. And as I've gestured toward, most of the city's economy depended upon the transatlantic slave trade. So most of the city's residents were involved or employed in some way with the transatlantic slave trade, which resulted in the city being known as the city of slavers or slave trading vessels. So there are hundreds of early African descended people who arrived in France during this era, and some of them are actually from Africa and made to be servants in the households of French citizens. Some of the other African descended people in the 18th century may have been descended from some of those early West Africans who were originally purchased as enslaved labor and made to be domestic servants. But we know that Allard at this time is free, and that he is said to have come from Wada, so it's likely that he is originally from Africa, and that he might have come to France free rather than as an enslaved person, and never have served as in a domestic capacity or even be descended from people that now live in Nantes. And although we can't determine his exact circumstances prior to 1717, we do know that by this year, for some reason, he is working in slave trading as a sailor. So this crew that left in spring of 1717 arrived in Wada in July to purchase enslaved African captives to fill their boat. They stay there until October of 1717, and during this time, they are waiting for the arrival of enough African captives to fill their voyage. So, usually, the people who might be sold as enslaved African captives are actually from the interior of Africa, so they might be marched in a line in coffles and brought to the coast, or they might ride in boats and small canoes toward the west coast. While this is going on, enslaved traders are waiting for there to be a large enough number of captives that have been brought to the coast so they can finally leave. And those enslaved captives who are already there waiting for the remaining people who will also be placed on the ship are imprisoned in forts that are on the coast. So on this particular voyage, Dosset purchases 516 African captives, so more than any of the other 2 voyages, because the first voyage in 1713 only had 418, and it's certainly much more than the 331 people purchased in 1715. And as is typical, these people were probably cramped beneath the ship, as most enslaved people were on ships. So this is a diagram of the deck of a ship, and you can see how beneath the deck A lot of enslaved people are cramped there. It looks as though they're laying, and there's not very much space in between them. And that's typical of how people might be packed on a slave trading vessel. So the ship leaves in October, but by late November in 1717, shortly before they're to arrive in their intended destination of Martinique, Blackbeard arrives with 2 ships full of his crew members, and he captures the ship, takes the gold that was stolen, takes the gold that is on board. He kidnaps some of the members of the crew, so he takes the doctor and some of the sailors and also the people necessary to repair the ship. Other members of the crew willingly leave with the pirates, and he also takes some of the African captives with him. So these people were on the Concorde, and they end up being on Queen Anne's Revenge, the enslaved people that are taken by the pirate and his crew. So the experiences of black people on the Concorde and Queen Anne's Revenge differed even under similar circumstances. The enslaved captives from the Dutch ship, the African captives from Wada in 1717 and 1713, and the 1715 captives from Congo probably all endured being taken from their homeland and brought to another place, probably in West Africa, where they might have been kept in holding for weeks before sailing across the Atlantic. While on the Concorde, they possibly were cramped up on a ship and beneath the deck, so very much like that image, with hundreds of other enslaved people in unsanitary conditions. On each of these voyages, the members of the ship's human cargo watched other enslaved captives die. The voyages that were successful and ordinary, so those in 1713 and 1715, were still traumatic. Those enslaved Africans who arrived on the privateering vessel would witness an attack and then have to be transferred to another boat. The African captives from 1717 saw 61 other enslaved people die during their voyage. They also witnessed the pirates attacking, and following the attack, there were only 455 people still alive at the time of the ambush. After the ambush, only 376 enslaved captives survived, which means that not only did some of them probably witness the ambush and the attack, they also experienced physical violence, and some of them quite possibly were mortally harmed. Those enslaved captives who remained alive and in possession of the Concorde's former crew had to be transferred to the new ship that Blackbeard gave them, where they would see another 20 more African captives die on their way to Martinique to be sold. And about 18 of those captives from the ship would end up staying on the Concorde and be taken by the pirates. So what they experience is in great contrast to Joseph Alibar's time on the ship in 1717. He had a very different experience. As a free person of color, he probably passed his time above the deck. He might have watched as Captain Dosset and the human traded for human cargo for their slave trading mission. Unlike the enslaved people who were probably below the deck when Blackbeard and his pirates first attacked, who only heard the terror rather than viewed it. As a sailor, Alibar might have seen the pirates come aboard. He then is able to choose to travel with Dosset to Martinique rather than leave with the pirates. And Alibar stays until the remaining enslaved people who were sold are then sold, and then he takes his pay. And at the time of the records, from the muster roll, he stays in Martinique. So we can assume that there are a lot of options. So he is a free man. He has experience as a sailor. He might get get a ride on another boat and travel somewhere else and continue working as a sailor. But in Martinique in the 18th century, there was a relatively large population of free people of color. So he could have very well stayed there, found a job, and settled down. And his life is very different than the fates that would await all of the enslaved people that traveled on the Concorde and Queen Anne's Revenge. So the historical record shows that black people sailed on and with the Concorde and Queen Anne's Revenge as African captives and slave trading sailors. And unfortunately, they didn't leave behind wills or baptismal records or marriage records, and they don't appear in censuses like the people on display here. So unlike Robert Wainwright, Maria Breton, Hannibal Collins, Arthur Tickey, and Ober Collins, who were part of the Newport Historical Society's exhibition, A Name, A Voice, A Life, Black Newporters of the 17th and 19th centuries, the names of the more than 1,200 enslaved captives on the Concorde are unknown. However, as Cicely Jones and Wendy Warren have encouraged, we can draw reasonable conclusions about what might have happened to them based on what we do know about their lives and what we know about typical slave trading experiences. So all of the more than 1,200 African captives probably met a harsh fate no matter what the outcome of their voyage was. So, thank you.